Certainly since the referendum, we've seen a massive surplus in our democracy and seen a lot more people get involved, and that's a terrific thing. Now, personally, I am of the working class. I'll be staying in Acker housing very shortly, from a farm labouring background before I took over my post office 11 years ago now. My mum's a nurse and my father is not a particularly wealthy crofter. In fact, if there was a living caricature of Wurzel Gummidge, he would probably be it. As it stands, I personally believe that all trade is good, and I don't believe in deregulation. I'm very environmentally minded. I support my local rejig recycling charity. I'm one of the directors of the board, not the only director on the board, I might add. I also support many charitable things as well, passes to the troops and those type. And Isla can seem isolated at times, there's no doubt about it. We seem to have regular power cuts and slow internet, much like the people of Oban and elsewhere. I hear the same concerns. But we can't be isolationists. We cannot turn our back on the world. And the founding of every great civilization, every great empire, it doesn't matter what it is, trade seems to be at the heart of it. And it's not just the big, faceless, multinational companies. I mean, I probably have as much skepticism about some of them as you do. Get me ranting about SSE and BT and all of them, and I'll probably be here all night. But it's small businesses that will be trading under this. On my island of Isla alone, in my post office, I see parcels distributed from small, independent, local family-run businesses every day. In the early 90s, groups like Argyll Tablet, one of our local tablet producers, that's the sweet tablet, not the computer tablet, were mainly selling their goods locally. Now they export to everywhere in the world. 60% of their trade is with America. My father, he's a crofter, he works for the forestry and he makes sticks. Again, in the early 90s when I was growing up, most of his trade was in fact locally. Now he exports everywhere in the world. And I've been around businesses in Loch Gilphead that are doing wonderful work, employing lots more people, and the economy is growing, and rightfully so. We're seeing Britain get back, and Scotland, particularly Argyll, to making things again. We cannot have an economy based entirely on banking and pushing paper around and rear echelon public sector salaries. It has to be based on producing and exporting real things. And to produce and export real things, we have to have a market for them. Opening up 300 million potential consumers is ideal for that. It doesn't loosen up regulation. In fact, in many areas, we're seeing duplication of 30 aspects of regulation over 30 times. Can you imagine getting on an aeroplane and going through the safety brief? It's a good thing we have the safety brief, it's a great thing. But would you like a quarter of that safety brief to be repeated 30 times? I don't think so. By repeating things over and over again, and duplication and over-regulation, we are killing our marketplace and our workforce. All growth and development and jobs come out of trade and an expansion in trade, and it's something we desperately need. As for a privatization of the NHS, I'm against it. It's not going to happen. It's not in relation to domestic politics, it's a trade agreement. My mum's a nurse. I can't afford private medical insurance, I really can't. So I have no interest in privatizing the one thing I depend on for my health and the health of my family. The NHS will stay, government institutions will stay. This is merely a trade agreement, but a huge trade agreement. A massive opportunity for this nation and one we should grasp. You're looking at £1.7 billion increase in potential revenue for Scotland alone. 10 billion for the United Kingdom, 100 billion for all of Europe. At a UK level, that amounts to £400 per household. That's no small amount. We have to enable businesses, individuals to grow. There is no liberty in poverty, and with low trade and protectionism, there is poverty. And we must defeat poverty and bring equality, and the best way to do that is through growth and growth of business. And I hope you will support Ttip. But above all else, I hope that you'll support the democratic process. I hope that no matter what happens today, whether you agree or disagree, you'll leave this room thinking that we've had a good discussion today. Thank you very much. Bye then.
Oh, that's all right, don't worry about it.
I will let the candidates know when we're 30 seconds short of the 5 minutes. Alan, is it yourself? Thank you very much.
I thought you were moving from left to right, that's fine. this. All right, okay, I'll have to hold them while, if you bear with me while I put my glasses on with one hand. Right, okay, thank you all very much for coming along to hear us tonight. This is a very important subject. The Ttip provides an opportunity to give a boost to our economy and create more jobs. The European Commission and the US government are still negotiating the treaty, so my comments tonight are based on the European Commission's stated negotiating position, not the final wording of the treaty, which won't be known for a few months yet. If and when the European Commission is satisfied and reaches an agreement with the United States government in principle over Ttip, the final agreement will be sent to the European Parliament and the 28 national parliaments within the EU. Any one of these parliaments can veto the deal. Now, the need to get all 29 parliaments to agree is a safeguard against anything controversial in Ttip. The UK Parliament and other parliaments will receive the complete draft text of the Ttip agreement and will have plenty of time to scrutinise it through debates in both houses of Parliament, and there will also be plenty of time for public debate and public consultation on the final wording of the treaty before any vote in Parliament. The European Commission's stated negotiating position is that the treaty could not be used to force the privatisation of health services or any other public services, or force governments to lower standards in, for example, food safety, environmental or employment regulations. If, contrary to the European Commission's negotiating position, that any of these did appear in the final treaty, then of course I would oppose the treaty, but I don't expect that to happen. After the EU, the United States is the biggest source of investment in the UK, and US firms already support an estimated 1 million British jobs. A deal would mean increased job opportunities, reduced prices for goods and services, and more choice. It would also help the consumer by allowing, for example, easier online purchases from the United States, as well as stronger consumer protection. The aim of Ttip is to remove tariffs. That would result in savings being passed on to the consumer. In some areas like cars, clothes, food and drink, removing tariffs would mean significant savings. It's estimated, for example, that the consumer would save 10% on cars and 12% in jeans. UK businesses currently pay the US government $1 billion a year in tariffs. That leads to higher prices in the shop. There'll be more choice. Ttip will open up the EU and US markets, which will mean increased competition, more choice for the consumer. Ttip could raise the level under which no import duty is payable. It's currently £135, and make the total cost of an order, that's price, delivery, VAT and customs duty, much cheaper and clear to the consumer when buying. There will be stronger consumer protection through online trading. And Ttip will make it easier for business in the EU to access a market of more than 300 million American consumers. Smaller companies will disproportionately benefit compared to larger ones, because Ttip aims to reduce unnecessary regulation which prevents small businesses in particular from expanding and hiring more staff, because they simply do not have the resources of legal firms and accountants in order to enter the United States market. So small businesses with less financial clout will benefit much more from this deal than big corporations. We could also use Ttip to access US gas, which is currently a third of the price in the EU. That would be a tremendous benefit towards making it cheaper for people to heat their houses. Throughout these negotiations, it's important to stress that the European Commission's stated negotiating position is that it has offered assurances that EU regulations on, for example, GM crops and the use of hormones are not up for negotiation. It's important to make it absolutely clear that no food produced in the United States by methods banned in the EU will be allowed into Europe. Ttip should make it easier to export food from the US to Europe. This will benefit thousands of small-scale food producers in the UK who have been prevented from exporting to the US at the moment. The US at the moment bans haggis. That would no longer be the case. I look forward to the extensive public debate which will take place once the actual wording of the treaty is known. This debate will take place in plenty of time before the UK Parliament votes on the final wording of the treaty. Free trade, not protectionism, has always delivered more jobs and lower prices. A Ttip that preserves regulatory standards is one to embrace, not one to fear.
Okay, next we'll hear from Mary.
Good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be here tonight. I hope you can see me over this. I think I'll just adjust this microphone down a wee bit. I feel like I'm kind of peeking over all the time. Some form of trade regulation has been with us for a long time. I mean, biblical times, when they tried to sell grain that contained too much stone, as you'll remember, there were efforts to try and cut that out. This isn't new, the idea that we try and regulate commerce and trade. And if we think back 100 or more years ago, the companies that we all dealt with here were typically local. Whether it was for food, banking, we had local banks primarily for those that ever used banks, and that wasn't many people more than 100 years ago. Local companies provided services, and regulation was, if you like, more of a word of mouth, and that applied right across the UK. Then you found that banks would merge, food providers would merge, and that all our other daily requirements were met by national rather than local companies, or much more so national. And now we've seen in the last 30, 40 years or so a much greater move towards transnational global companies. And so whereas previously there would have been small local banks in and around Glasgow, different local savings banks who then went to UK banks, and now most people bank with organisations like Santander that have a global footprint. Therefore, if the people we're dealing with, the people we need to rely on, and businesses rely on, and consumption and trade that goes on in our daily lives is transnational, then regulation needs to be in that same basis as well. Wouldn't it have been great if there was proper regulation of subprime mortgages a few years ago? We'd have been in a much different position now. So we can't have trade continuing freely the way it is without having some form of transnational regulation. And that is what any good treaty should do. And as Marie was pointing out, we have lots of treaties already. The UK has treaties and the EU has lots of treaties. It's currently, I think, finishing, or there are recently agreed ones with Singapore and Canada. So the idea that we have these treaties isn't new, but what Ttip is a different one in terms of scale and impact. And that's why it's quite rightly coming under scrutiny. So, having given you a wee bit of what my view is, that we need trade, we need regulation, we need treaties to make sure that our inevitable international and global trade is regulated, what are the principles that I think should be abided by as we look to judge this treaty when it's ultimately presented to us? First one I'd like to mention is standards. There cannot be any reduction in the standards we currently enjoy. Why would we want that? Why would anybody want that? And that's been quite clearly the point of view expressed by the Labour MEPs, the Labour Party in Europe. We've said that when it comes to standards for things like food, so product standards, no reduction. It's going to be an interesting one with iron brew actually, because iron brew at the moment is one of those goods that isn't allowed in the US because there's a particular ingredient in it that they don't allow. And they would maybe see their standards having to drop if they were to allow iron brew to be imported, but we'll see about that. So we don't want food standards, for example, or other consumer goods standards dropping. We don't want environmental standards dropping. Our cars tend not to be gas guzzlers, and that's not always true of American cars. So we don't want our vehicle market flooded with gas guzzling cars when we've already done a lot of work to improve the environmental standards. Nor do we want our labour, health and safety standards reduced either. There's no joy in having cheaper goods if they're all done on the back of people's lives and safety. There are 3 times more deaths at work in the United States than there are in Europe, and that should be a lesson to all of us to realise that actually there could be some very high prices to be paid if we accept any reduction in labour standards and health and safety at work. So we've got standards. Transparency needs to be improved. It has already started to improve since the likes of the campaign that Marie's been involved in. Is it Marie or Marie? Sorry. Marie has been involved in. There is a bit more transparency, but we need a lot more. Inevitably, negotiations need to be carried on within certain qualified environments, but I think there was much more scope to be transparent, which is why now there are fact sheets. You can go onto the European Union's own a website for it, there's even a Twitter account for it. So we need standards, transparency, we need to make sure that public services aren't part of it. There have been commitments on that. It has always been the case for already Britain can decide not to allow European companies within the EU to bid for health and other services if we choose to. So we need to keep our NHS out of Ttip, and we also need, I think, to have the dispute resolution process that's being proposed taken out. We already have legal mechanisms for companies to deal with it. It's not required. So my position and my party's position is one of qualified acceptance of the principle, but we need to see the detail. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll now hear from Brendan, who's got a hard task in his to get the word subprime mortgage and Iron Brew into the same paragraph.
I don't think I will. Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I think Ttip one of those absolutely fascinating topics, and born out of the fact that so many people are here this evening. And for the record, I'm extremely wary about Ttip, and I'm extremely suspicious about the process that we have gone through to get to where we are at the moment with Ttip. And Alastair, if this was just about trade, I'd be an awful lot more relaxed about it. But I think Ttip is much, much bigger than just a trade agreement. I don't think that Ttip, as we currently see it, is in the interests of the Scottish people. I think it would restrict any future Scottish government and its ability to manage vital public services in a way that they deem fit and in the best interest of our people. And there's nothing wrong with trade. I absolutely agree with you, Mary, and I think that trade has got to be encouraged, but not at all costs. It cannot be the sole driver. There has to be an awful lot more propping up an agreement than just free trade. So my concerns about Ttip are that I see it principally in protecting corporate interests ahead of those of the individual, the consumer, and in many cases even the national interest. I think that at its core, Ttip is about privatisation of vital public services, including the NHS. And I know that Lord Livingston recently said that the NHS would be protected and it wouldn't be part of it. They're supposed to use that classic Scottish double positive. Aye, right. You know, I'll believe it when I see it. You know, if it was going to be explicitly taken out of Ttip, then put it in the statute. Let's see that it is, because I will not trust a Conservative minister when he says that Ttip is not about privatising the NHS until I see it in black and white. I think there's a lot to concern ourselves about the regulatory coherence of Ttip between the European Union and Canada. It will bring together everything from pharmaceuticals, banking regulations, workers' standards and the environment. And I fear that it could be a race to the bottom for regulation, standards, pay and conditions. For example, US federal law in the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry in America are exempt from the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Emergency Planning and the Community Right to Know Act. And I think that that level of laissez-faire politics is not what Scotland needs, and it's not what the United Kingdom needs. And I fear as well that what we're seeing with Ttip is almost the imposition of an economic orthodoxy across the world. And that is a neoliberal orthodoxy. And that worries me hugely, because I believe that there are some people looking at Ttip and they are wanting to shrink the role of the state. It's almost an ideological crusade to shrink the role of the state, and I, for one, am absolutely opposed to that. We've heard a lot about interstate dispute settlement, and they've tried to tell us that it's been shelved. Perhaps it's been shelved, but it certainly hasn't gone away, and I don't expect it to go away. And that is extremely worrying. We've had a couple of examples from Marie. Another one, you know, Philip Morris are using a version of the interstate dispute settlement currently to pursue the Australian and the Uruguay government for their public health approach. in trying to ban smoking, or certainly to cut smoking. And Philip Morris, the great tobacco giant in America, see this as an attack on their profits. So when governments are pursuing public health policies as vital as encouraging the population to stop smoking, for them then to be sued by a multinational company is extremely wrong. And I also think that Ttip is profoundly, what we've seen so far, is profoundly undemocratic. From John O'Groats to the tip of Greece, no one has been asked about Ttip. No one has voted on Ttip. Ttip has been from a creation of the European Union and the American government, and that worries me, it really does. I contacted Alan Smith just before I came here today, and Alan Smith got back to me. I asked him what he'd seen of Ttip, and he said, the European Union negotiating documents are now available to MEPs. They're in a secure reading room, literally locked in a vault where MEPs can go in and read through the documents. Before entry, I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevents me from telling anyone what I read. Nor can I pass on that information to anyone, the information I have in my head, to anyone, not even in my own team. I've only seen the EU's negotiating position. Nothing has been released from the Americans, so we only have half the picture. It's profoundly undemocratic if people elected to represent us in Europe have to go through those hoops in order to see our negotiating position. And until and unless I can be convinced that it is different, I will oppose Ttip. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all our speakers. Alastair's the only one that gets the prize. He was the only one within his time. Trying to be generous there. Brendan gets the wooden spoon by 8 seconds. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from Marie, whose organisation prompted this debate tonight. It's one of a number of debates. There's already been one in Lochaber with the candidates there. There is to be one in Inverness next Friday night with the candidates there. There's arrangements underway to have one in Caithness and Sutherland. So you've heard from the candidates as well. Questions, please.
Gentlemen.
Mr. McCush.
Hi, John. What effect, if any, if we do sign up to this treaty, would it have if Britain came out of Europe?
Is that it on now? Right. It would, in all probability, is my understanding, have zero effect because we wouldn't be bound by it. It's an agreement between the EU and the United States. However, a lot of people have said we could opt out of the European Union and have the status that Norway has. Norway have got non-member status, but they comply with lots of the requirements and get, therefore, access to lots of the benefits without having any of the democratic input into the process. So if we wanted to have that kind of Norway-type model, we would then be under, in all possible, well, there's a good probability, I think, that would be under the auspices of that particular trade agreement if we wanted to benefit from it, if we wanted those markets, for example. Trade will still go on, but it's just the basis on which it happens. I mean, trade's going on right now. There are treaties right now. There are already treaties that govern what we do and don't, how we do business with the United States. These things are not impossible at the moment. It's just how we do them. And as people have said, it needs to be transparent. It will be seen, but this isn't. It's not new that we have treaties. We've always had them. We always will. And it's just we need to see the contents of this one in the next few months.
I agree with Mary. It would depend on the agreement that we had with the EU after we came out. If we had no agreement at all, then Ttip wouldn't apply. If we had some form of association, as Norway and some of the other smaller European countries have, then Ttip would still apply. So it would all depend on what was negotiated when we left the EU.
Yeah, I mean, alright, so I've got to do this for now, yeah. Not quite beatboxing yet, but I'm getting there. As it stands, I support remaining in the EU, but I believe it needs to be reformed. I was actually quite sceptical to EU reform until I had a visit in my shop from the kiwi fruit measuring man. It's a true story, this. I get all my fruit and veg from Mr. Ferguson, the local fruit and veg supplier. And I was hearing on the Vine show about, unfortunately, the troubles they're having in Greece, and mass unemployment, riots, all these terrible things. And I see these two officials come in with the clipboards. I said, okay, we're here to look at your fruit and veg. And they demanded to know why all these things weren't labelled properly. And I explained to them, everyone knows where I get my fruit and veg from, the same person. And then they went around measuring my kiwis. They said to me, I'm sorry, sir, your kiwi fruits are 3 millimeters too small. And I thought, that really is ridiculous. This is something that has to change. As Greece burns, the EU is complaining about the size of fruit and veg on Islay, for God's sake. So Europe's not perfect. Ttip won't be perfect. All large governmental decisions and large trade organisations aren't perfect. Overall, I support it. Everything needs to be reformed. And certainly I support us staying in a reformed Europe. Thank you.
Have you had your kiwi fruits measured? That's a discussion for the bar. What would happen if we come out of the EU? I think so Mary and Alan have covered that. I think it's worth saying it would be, from Scotland's point of view, I think it would be absolutely disastrous if Scotland, as independent Scotland or as part of the United Kingdom, came out of the European Union. So what I would do is we stay in the European Union and we fight Ttip, we fight and demand transparency for Ttip so we know what our governments are signing up to on our behalf, because that's the problem. We do not know what our governments are signing up to, and until we do, then I would be extremely sceptical.
Gentleman at the front. All right, that was both ends. Yes, sir.
We heard a lot about multinational, transnational, global companies. Already in the UK, we have quite a few of these fairly famous companies, and the tax take to the Treasury is minimal or non-existent in the case of some of them. If elected, what will you and your party do to take steps to address this, and why should we trust you?
Well, maybe we'll try and get our secrets going here. So you start this time, Alastair, please.
Hello? Yeah, I'm someone who pays my business tax rates, and it angers me immensely when I hear of these large companies.
The problem has always been that with multinational companies, they have always attempted to arrange their affairs so that they claim to make their money in countries with low tax regimes. But the countries throughout the world are now cooperating together much better, and there are rules that have been drawn up for increased transparency, because all governments throughout the world don't benefit by companies avoiding taxation. So there's agreements in place which will mean that by 2017 there will be much greater transparency about where companies make their money. And that means that it will be much easier for governments to make sure that these companies pay the taxes that they are due to pay. And just this morning, Danny Alexander, on behalf of the coalition government, announced a new draft of measures that were going to be taken to make sure that these companies all pay their taxes. I'm confident that from 2017 onwards, the companies will find it far, far more difficult to evade their taxes, because governments throughout the world have got together and agreed on transparency.
Personally, what I've done is I signed the tax dodging bill petition yesterday. I don't know if you've seen it. It says that if you're elected and there's a bill goes before Parliament in the first 100 days to make tax dodging illegal, or to certainly block up the loopholes in the legislation, would you support it? And I said absolutely, 100%. I think that what we are seeing now is one of the great scandals of our time, when so many multinational companies are using tax loopholes in the United Kingdom's law to avoid paying any tax at all.
And it's not just that they're getting away with not paying any tax. It means that, you know, if somewhere like Starbucks was to open here and there was an independent cafe across the road, who would have to pay its full, and rightly so, pay its full dues when it comes to taxation, and Starbucks doesn't pay anything, then there's only one of those cafes going to go out of business, and it'll be the local cafe. I think as a small businessman myself, I know how enthusiastic the HMRC can be when seeking their dues from the small guy. I think it feeds into a culture, a really awful culture within the United Kingdom at the moment, where people are they're actively encouraged to diddle their tax, actively encouraged not to pay their fair share. And the whistleblower at the HSBC a couple of months ago, I think he did us all a huge service. And it was interesting that the United Kingdom alone didn't prosecute a single tax dodger whose name was given to them. They came to a cosy deal in order to pay some of it back, but largely they got away with it. Now, I'd like to see me trying to negotiate a similar deal if I decide next year not to pay my tax. Fat chance.
A couple of things to say. Firstly, there was the most awful carnage committed to HMRC after 2010. Massive cuts to the inspectorate, and as a consequence, they've not been able to do what it is they're there to do, which is to investigate and to pursue defaulters. And that's ridiculous. It's just not acceptable that we've not invested, because the payback, there's some very simple numbers at play here. Each revenue inspector or tax inspector can bring so much money to the exchequer, far, far more than it costs to keep them, but yet in this massive rush in 2010 that George Osborne had to cut so much of our public sector, we've left ourselves in the ridiculous situation where lots of businesses, and it's not just the big ones, it's some medium-sized ones as well, who just don't pay their fair due, and there's not enough people to pursue them. So our revenue inspector, tax inspectors, we need more of them. We need to re-establish that function and to have it working properly, to work for our country and bring in the money that we need. So that would be one of my first commitments, is to re-establish an effective tax service. Secondly, I think what's really quite good is the fact that this is right up the agenda. People are now rightly indignant at the behaviour of HSBC and everyone else, and I think that's good. I think it's about time that people didn't assume that just because you're in a big shiny office you must be doing the right thing and behaving legally. Those days are gone, and I'm really glad about that. So I think that's really healthy, and I will never ever be party to any slide back into the complacency that assumes that just because you're big and corporate and multinational you must be playing by the rules, because as we've seen with the Vodafone deal that they did with HMRC, as well as the likes of HSBC, that's just not happened. So my commitment is to never ever assume that the big guys are going to play any safer than anyone else, and to get the revenue service back up and running.
Okay, thanks for that. I took it, we're Ttip event tonight, I took it to be the effect that Ttip may or may not have on that. Can we just go around the panel and all, with a yes or no, do you think Ttip will facilitate easier tax avoidance, yes or no?
I think it's impossible to say, because we haven't got the visibility of what it's going to do in that. The theory is, sorry?
Take a guess.
Let me just say though, what I am pleased about is Marie mentioned ACTA, which was one of the other trade agreements that got thrown out 2 or 3 years ago by the European Parliament. I have every confidence, because of the indignation that we all feel about this sort of issue, if there's any suggestion that there's scope for greater or continued avoidance like this, the MEPs will throw it out. I do not expect Ttip to survive unless it ticks the boxes I gave you around standards, transparency, ISDS out, and public services out. Unless it does those 4 things, it's not going to survive.
that yes or no?
On,
On the question.
I don't have the transparency to see, none of us does. None of us have got the details, so we can't tell.
Yeah, unfortunately, tax evasion exists now and will exist after Ttip. If you were to push me for an answer, it would be no. Overall, I don't feel it will have an effect on tax evasion. I certainly hope it doesn't, and I'm completely against it, as all good people should be, including all fair taxpayers. But tax evasion, unfortunately, will never be eradicated. I wish it was, but it won't be. So it will exist after Ttip, as well as it has before, but no, I don't think it will increase it.
I don't think Ttip will make any difference as far as tax evasion is concerned, one way or another. The way to tackle tax evasion, as I alluded to earlier, is for governments to work together. Of course, big companies are, like anybody, is going to do their absolute best to avoid paying their taxes. And in the past, because governments have not been cooperating with passing data to one another, then companies have been able to get away with that. So it's because governments throughout the world have now committed to working together much better, then that's the way we're going to tackle tax evasion. On the HSBC case, the reason that prosecution didn't happen was that the Swiss authorities refused to cooperate, and the Crown Prosecution Service in Britain concluded that without the cooperation of the Swiss authorities, they simply couldn't gather the evidence to prove the case. So it's by much greater working together of governments that we're going to tackle the appalling tax evasion by big companies. But I think Ttip's a separate issue, and I don't think it will make any difference one way or another to that.
I think that it could help tax avoiders. I think as well that had it not been brought out in the open by campaigners, that it almost certainly would have helped tax avoiders, because I think the last thing that the European Commission wanted was to have a light shone on Ttip the way it has been before Ttip was taken into European law. So I think that campaigners like Marie and others across Europe who have, as I say, shone a light on what was going on within the European Union and as much of the detail as we can possibly get on Ttip have done everybody in Europe a huge service, and they should be applauded for it.
I detect a host of paranoia and fearfulness from certain people here. It says very plainly on this, the negotiations are conducted in secret. Oh dearie me. I mean, the panel of all, with one exception, have pointed out that trade agreements have existed for many years. General Agreement of Trades and Tariff, European Free Trade Agreement, European Free Trade Agreement, a precursor and associated with the European Union. My question is, I notice this leaflet is quite a glossy leaflet. This other one, I would like to know by whom it is printed, by whom it is published, on behalf of whom is it being is the European Citizens Initiative being promoted? I'm being paranoid too. May I please ask, who's it printed by? I mean, this would actually be ruled illegal in an election campaign.
Can I see the leaflets?
Could you show them?
Yeah, they're at the front door.
They're my leaflets.
Marie, please.
Wait. Marie, would you?
No, I don't need them. Right. Fine. I printed the leaflets. They haven't got anything to do with the election campaign. They're for the ECI campaign. I paid to have them printed myself. I designed them.
That's still illegal. It's still illegal. There's nothing on this printed by, published by, promoted by. As somebody who has suffered this in an election campaign, by the Lib Dem, by the way, you have to disclose where, on behalf of whom you're doing it. There's a lot of money involved. Could be a lot of money. And a lot of people being pressurised, you people being pressurised to come here tonight at a great deal of expense. And I would like to know on behalf of whom the European Citizens Initiative is being waged. I noticed a heck of a lot of applause from certain well-recognised faces that I see here, and not from others.
Well, I think you heard your answer. It is Marie that printed these, and
Promoted behalf.
well, that's for I'm afraid that's for Marie. I was just asked would I chair tonight's meeting, but I think you made your point, and I think it is important that people understand where everyone is coming from. Yes.
I was only going to suggest that these election regulations are about promotion of candidates. There's no candidate involved here.
No.
Well, I wonder just if I could knock something in the head here then, and that does relate to a certain word, if I could take a privilege in the share, a certain word that keeps appearing in all the information I see from all the political parties. And I'll start with Brendan, and it's the word opportunity. Opportunity is the word that the First Minister has used in relation to Ttip. All the parties have used the word opportunity in relation to Ttip. Now, perhaps all of the candidates, and I think we'll start with Alan this time, will say, who is that opportunity for?
Well, the opportunity is there for everybody. It's there for consumers. I referred earlier to how consumers would get much greater consumer protection if, for example, they were buying goods online from the United States. Free trade always brings prices down. It will bring prices down in the shops. It will be good for small businesses, because small businesses that perhaps want to break into the American market find it far too difficult to do so at the moment. With a free trade agreement, they will find it much easier. So there's opportunity there for everybody. That's the plus side of it. Now, there is obviously the concerns about regulations, but as I also said earlier, the European Commission's negotiating position is that Europe and countries within Europe will still decide their own regulations. So I believe that as long as the negotiating position is maintained in the final treaty, and we will see the final treaty before Parliament has to vote on it, and there will be plenty of time for public consultation, public debate, legal advice on the final version of the treaty before we vote on it. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity there, and I think we can achieve the benefits without any of the concerns that have been expressed tonight actually materialising.
Call me paranoid, but I think you were talking about me.
If the cat fits, wear it.
Could I say, for the record, until this evening, I'd never met Marie. In fact, I walked past her in the foyer, and she used to call me back and say, hello, I'm Marie. And I've never clapped eyes on either of these leaflets before tonight, so that's absolutely on the record. Opportunity. Yes, I believe that trade agreements do present themselves as opportunities. I think well-constructed, transparent trade agreements are exceptionally good things. I think they can be hugely beneficial. I don't believe that Ttip, as we currently understand it to be, is anything than an opportunity primarily for multinational corporations. It's interesting, Joyce Nelson, the Canadian investigative journalist, said earlier this month, she described Ttip, perhaps slightly flowery, and I wouldn't sign up to this entirely, but she described Ttip as a corporate coup d'etat. And she says it elevates private firms and investors to the same status as sovereign governments, and in essence amounts to the privatisation of the justice system. Now, I'm not necessarily signing up to everything that Joyce Nelson says, but I don't think you can automatically dismiss it. I don't think you can just say, there's nothing to see here, run along, everything will be fine. So, trade, I have nothing against trade. I think that it could and it should benefit business and individuals and consumers alike. My concern with Ttip is that it's, as we currently understand it, it doesn't do that. And until I'm convinced that it does do that, I will continue to oppose.
Yep. Okay. Right. I looked out the S2UC, the Scottish Trade Union Congress submission to the Scottish Parliament on this, and they did a lot of the research for me, which is great. So they've actually worked out who the opportunities for, John. It's a very good question. I liked it. And they said the studies they looked at found that the boost in total EU exports outside the single market would be particularly significant in metal products, processed foods, so I think that's good for bars and Irn-Bru, chemicals, other manufactured goods, and especially motor vehicles, in which Scotland is weak. So, for Scotland, there aren't really that many jobs there, except for bars maybe. It doesn't attempt to quantify the net jobs impact, but does acknowledge that some sectors, such as other transport equipment, in which Scotland, it turns out, is relatively strong, may be adversely affected. So while there may be some winners, it might not be that many for us, and there are just as likely to be some losers. Because we don't actually have that many barriers or that much regulation at the moment in the sectors in which we're strong. What stops us being better is a whole series of other factors about being efficient and successful in reaching markets, and it tends not to be trade routes that is stopping us being more successful or for whom the opportunities might exist. So I don't think there are that many opportunities, if I'm brutally honest. I think they're probably being overstated because some of the detail says it's only certain sectors and some of them we're not that strong at. And if I can just finish with one wee anecdote from my own personal experience as well. Years ago, I remember back in the 70s, nitrate fertilisers in the 60s were being sold by Fisons and the other big agri companies as they were going to solve world hunger. World hunger would end if all farmers just really dozed on lashings and lashings of nitrate fertilisers. Well, a lot of them found out very soon and very quickly that the only people that got rich on nitrate fertilisers were Fisons. Certainly wasn't farmers, because they were shelling out the money for it. Supply was going up, prices were dropping, and they were ending up poorer. Because the more nitrate fertilisers you used on your land, as the environmentalists have all told us since, the more you had to use. It's like a drug, it's like an addiction. The more you use, the more you need to use to get the same hit. So on all these great promises of vast riches for farmers, Fisons got rich and farmers didn't. And sometimes I think we just need to hold that same scepticism that a lot of, I don't know if there are any farmers or crofters here that do or don't use nitrate fertilisers, but you'll probably recognise some of what I'm saying. In other words, a lot of the big businesses, very slick at telling us all the opportunities and who it's going to be great for, usually them. And we just need to be as sceptical as your average crofter is in the Oban area. Thank you.
Now you've mentioned a farming thing, I have to be awkward and say my father swears by nitrate fertiliser, and he has 250 acres of both arable and rough grazing. But of course, oh yeah, no, 250 acres crofting. And of course it's mixed arable ground too. It is a mixture. And it's also one of the sort of poorer crofts. I do always argue the toss when people claim that all landowners are wealthy. It's complete nonsense, frankly.
You said it's ag croft.
Indeed. As for this leaflet, and I'm sorry, I do have to go back to it, I actually don't have a problem with this. I disagree with the content, however, good for you for being involved. Frankly, I think more people should be politically involved and be putting out their leaflets. Although I disagree with the content, frankly, it's good to see someone involved. As for opportunities, yes, some will gain more than others. And there is some departments we're weak in and some departments we're better in, but we should be strive to be better in all of them. We need to be manufacturing our way into growth, not just creating property bubbles and banking sector madness. We need to make things again in this country, and again, we need to export more. And for that to happen, we need those export markets. 300 million potential consumers for British companies, both big and small, is no bad thing. And I really think there's opportunity for all, there's potential for all, there's growth for all, some more than others, that's true. There will always be inequality in the world, unfortunately.
Gentleman up the back.
Talked about the opportunity for businesses and what we the consumer will get. But what's opportunities for workers' rights? We know America is very anti-union, so what changes in it? Is there going to be changes in health and safety at work? Is there going to be changes in food? what's it going to do for the worker? You know, do we have an opportunity? Or are all our rights going out the window?
So, Alastair, this time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a trade union man myself, believe it or not. The National Federation of Surplus Masters. It debates whether it's a trade union or a trade federation. But I believe in workers' rights, and I also believe in higher salaries for lower-end, lower-skilled jobs. The best way to have higher salaries for lower qualified workers is through economic growth, and you don't get economic growth without trade. Forgive me for being impertinent, sir. I notice you're wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt. The irony is not lost on me. Would Che Guevara himself like you to be buying t-shirts in a store? But that's a very good question about workers' rights, and it should never be ignored. And I always support workers' rights where possible. I myself am not from a privileged background, and I couldn't find eating with 2 hands and a man. And I'm also a trade union person too, although I disagree with perhaps where some of the bosses are putting their political funds right now. So yes, I'd always be for workers' rights, as long as they are workers' rights and not the political aspirations of union bosses. Thank you.
Well, workers' rights will not be affected. It will still be up to member states to put in place their own regulations for the rights that workers have. And there are also workers' rights that minimum standards that derive from the EU social chapter, and they will not be affected. So workers' rights will not be badly affected in any way. But the workers are also consumers, so the worker will gain when they go to the shop or they try to buy online, because they will then find that prices of goods imported from America will be cheaper, because there won't be the tariff barriers anymore. So when you're buying something in from America, you're no longer, part of what you're paying will no longer go to the American government in customs charges. So that's where workers will gain, because they're also consumers, but there will be no detriment to them, because it will not affect employment laws in any way.
I think the bottom line is, we don't know. We don't know, and that's the fear. And I go back to the point I made previously, that had this gone through on the nod, as I suspect the European Commission and many national governments would have wanted it to do, then we would have been at the mercy of European commissioners and the US trade people, and I, for one, wouldn't trust them. I think that there is too much evidence to suggest that their regulatory convergence would start a race to the bottom. That would be the fear, that the worst parts of UK employment legislation and protection would become standard, and the worst parts of the United States employment legislation and safety procedures would become standard. And at that point, you lower the bar for everybody across Europe. If you lower the bar for everyone across Europe and North America, and you go down into Central America, then the rest of the world will inevitably follow. So the danger is, and it is a fear, I admit that it is a fear, but the fear is that that is what could happen. And as I say, I go back to the point, I think without a light being shone on this, we would be going down a road where we had no idea where it was leading. We'd probably still go down a road with no idea where it's leading, but at least we're aware we're on the road.
I share a lot of your concerns about standards. Health and safety was one of the ones I mentioned, where 3 times as many American workers die at work than is the case, per worker in Europe. So that, for us, for the Labour Party and the Labour MEPs, is an absolute that can't be. There can be no dropping of those types of standards. The paternity leave that the UK government has, the maternity, all those national and European conditions cannot drop as part of this, or it won't get approval. So from that point of view of your basic terms and conditions, you ought to be no worse off. Where there could be some opportunity and benefits for workers is if you take distilleries, for example, of which we've got more than a few in Argyll and Bute. If part of this results in some tariff barriers for the produce that we make here in Argyll and Bute been brought down, and we're able to export more. That in theory brings greater demand for more activity in the distilleries and for all the companies that supply the distilleries. So in theory, if those volumes go up, that's more jobs, and it's more potential also for the companies to pay their workers. That's a theory, and that we need to see what the practice looks like when we see the evidence, but that could be one of the opportunities, and that's the theory around having well negotiated trade agreements that minimise and reduce tariffs to promote the products that we make here in Argyll and Bute.
Thank you. Gentleman at the front here.
Yeah, Mr. Reid said that workers' rights would never be under threat, yet we heard earlier of
other countries breaking the rules. Now, it's important that we get the wording of this ISDS agreement right, but we don't know what that is yet, but that will become publicly available long before Parliament has to vote on it, and we can then have a public debate and get legal advice.
This may not come as any huge surprise to you. I would oppose the ISDS, absolutely. And I think if you look at what's happening in Canada, I think Canada currently is the 6th most sued country in the world under ISDS. And there's one good that's been fast-tracked through the tribunal at the moment, and it's a Lone Pine Resources company, which sounds all very, very nice, but actually Lone Pine are a fracking company. And when the government of Quebec decided to outlaw fracking in 2013, Lone Pine sued the government of Quebec. And as I say, that's currently been fast-tracked through the tribunal. And it's not a national government, it's not a national court of national judges that sit in it, it's a tribunal of corporate lawyers. And it's, well, I wonder just how fair and impartial and independent a tribunal of corporate lawyers can be when hearing a case from sort of large multinational companies against the interests of, whether it's a state or, in the case of Quebec, a devolved state or a federal state. So no, I oppose ISDS.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman at the right, please.
Chairman, tonight we've been listening to candidates all dancing on a pin around something that's happening which is being done in secret in circumstances that they don't know the outcome of. So it's impossible for them to give assessments, but it's impossible. And Mary's right in saying they don't have an answer because they can't have an answer. However, in a democratic sense, there are two things they could do. What they could do is they could say that they would make it perfectly clear through their party, through their organisation, to make it perfectly clear that the health service in Britain is absolutely protected and must be, and so that the negotiators who are in the quiet room hear the message. Yep. Don't come with something because you won't get it. The British government hasn't done that. The British government has run away from that. It has to be done. Second, and that applies to workers' rights and other things. That has to be done. The message has to be got across, and got across in that way. If that is done, then you're unlikely to get the sort of message that you have to then fight later, yes, because you'll frighten them off before they do it. The other point is this: business is not all the same, Alastair. Big business is not the same as small business. It's not all the same. And what happens in actual fact is that the people who are in that room doing the secret negotiations are the very people who are not paying the tax while you are. Right? Yeah.
A few points in there. We'll go to Alan first this time.
Well, I'll read out a letter from Cecilia Malmström, and apologies to any Swedish speakers in the audience if I got that wrong, who is the European Commissioner responsible for the Ttip negotiations. She says in her letter, we make sure that governments do not have to open up any of their public service markets, such as publicly funded health services, to private operators if they do not want to, and that should they choose to do so, there is nothing to prevent them reversing this decision in the future. Now that seems clear to me. That's the negotiating position. That's a negotiating position that the UK government agrees with. And should Mrs Malmstrom come back with an agreement that doesn't conform to that, then I would certainly oppose Ttip, and I can assure you that the Liberal Democrats as a party would oppose Ttip. I don't expect Mrs Malmstrom to come back with an agreement that breaches that, because she knows it has to go through the UK Parliament, and she knows that it wouldn't get through the UK Parliament if she broke that promise that she's made in that letter.
Excuse me.
No, point of order.
You said if they choose to do so, inferring there is a commitment on the government to exclude them.
Sorry, I don't
As I
follow.
read it, as I
But no, listen.
Well, I'm happy to have a conversation, but I don't follow what you're.
Did you not read that these things would be safe if the government chooses to do so?
Yes.
Did you not use the phrase if they choose to do so?
Yes, if any government can choose to put their health service out to privatise it, should they want to.
Going back to the gentleman's question, he's asking, would you and your parties safeguard the health service?
Yes.
That's all we wanted to comment.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I'm happy to give that assurance.
Well, we're reading things. 4th of December 2014, Nicola Sturgeon said, "I will fight tooth and nail against any moves to privatise the NHS in Scotland by the back door. And if the Ttip agreement ever put that threat, it would be opposed strongly by this government." So it's fairly unequivocal that the NHS is not up for negotiation of this.
Yeah, likewise, we've all been getting our briefings. I made extensive use of David Martin's office, the Labour MEP who's been heavily involved in this, and was actually going to try and come here tonight, as I mentioned to Marie, but we then stood him down, and anyway. So, at Marie's request, because we didn't know how we were going ahead, but anyway, that's fine. He points out that EU trade agreements have always included both general and specific provisions that national governments can include or exclude those services. So it's backing up what Alan's saying. But what the Labour MEPs are obviously cast iron clear on, that they are not going to allow or any way sanction the privatisation of the NHS. You know, you can rest assured there's no Labour candidate anywhere, I can give you that assurance, would say anything else other than that our health service and education and water would be out with that they would be there for the public sector here in Scotland, if that's what the Scottish Government wants to do, because it's only the Scottish Government that could privatise or take a decision to privatise health, education and water in those circumstances.
Yeah, I'm completely against the privatisation of our health service, as is the Conservative Party, both north and south of the border. Although we have well, I'm sorry, I noticed some Labour people laughing. It's interesting hearing from Labour on this, as they weaponise our health service. During the referendum campaign, they fought side by side with us, saying there will be no privatisation of our health service, something I agree with. Yet, the minute we win the referendum, rightfully so, Labour turns round and up and decides that, in fact, it turns out the UK government is going to privatise the health service. I'm afraid that's simply not true. Labour have U-turned on this, and the fact that you're laughing bothers me, because in the referendum campaign they said there would be no privatisation of the health service, and now that the referendum is won, Labour have turned and said it will be. It is always the failing of every single argument when someone tries to weaponise the health service. When all other things fail, they roll out the health service. I have no interest in nationalising the health service. My mum's a nurse and has been a nurse for 40 years. I can't afford private treatment. I can only use the NHS. I have no interest whatsoever in privatising the health service, and I completely reject some of the laughter from some of the people in here that perhaps don't know me and my situation.
Well, I think unequivocal answers from both candidates there. Another question, please? Yes, sir.
I'm at a loss to see what's in this for the forces of the United States, or those that are pushing for it from the United States side. Because, I mean, whether it's good for us or not, what's in it for them?
Okay, round of listening.
I think access to European markets. I think there's a huge European market which the United States could access and profit from. I think as well that, as we said earlier on, with the deregulation, you know, if there is one set of regulations from you know, Seattle to Athens, then you know there's a lot of money to be made. A lot of money to be made by this so-called race to the bottom. So I can see why this would be extremely attractive to the United States, because where there's money to be made, the United States will always find a way to access that pot of gold.
Because some of our largest growth is in those areas. It's merely a separate trade deal. We will not be excluding China. It would be a detriment to British businesses that export quality goods to China, frankly, if we were excluding them. So I do not want to see Ttip excluding anyone, nor will it. That is not what it is put there for.
Yes, I'd agree with Alastair. I mean, I don't see Ttip as having a detrimental impact on anyone else. It's improving trade links between the EU and the United States, but that still leaves the EU and the United States free to negotiate free trade agreements with anybody else, including China. So I think it's a benefit to both the EU and the US, and no detriment to anybody else.
I think the only detriment could be that if other trading areas feel they are being competitively disadvantaged by this massive bloc who seem to have the same regulations, the same standards, which then is attractive to other investors, then I don't know is the answer. I don't know what could come of it, but I don't, as everyone else says, I don't think it's necessarily detrimental. I don't think we're likely to see a Third World War out of Ttip.
Well, that's reassuring. Okay, you heard it first here.
So back to me if I'm wrong.
We probably wouldn't be able to.
Yes.
You've all touched upon Ttip opening up US gas and car markets and less regulation perhaps. Can you all confirm, although some of you have given an opinion a little bit, where you stand on it and how you think we can meet our global carbon emissions if we continue to open up that kind of market?
Okay, I've forgotten who starts first this time.
It's not me.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, indeed. The question related to how, if this treaty were enacted, if I heard you correctly, how, if this treaty were enacted, we're going to meet what are already challenging climate change targets.
Well, I'm someone who supports these climate change targets. And I might add that I reject this stupid notion that environmentalism is of the left and Victorian era industry is of the right. That's simply not true. In fact, you only have to look at the smokestacks of the collapsed Soviet Union to realize that it was anything but environmental. In fact, Lenin and Marx all talked about the environment being a resource to be exploited. I support all of our goals when it comes to environmentalism. And of course, America is heading greener too. Cars are getting more efficient, they're running longer, the refining process is also better. As it stands, I support all of our environmental protocol, and I think Ttip will enhance America's ability to do so.
Alan?
Yes, it's a fair point, because clearly if we become better off, then with more money to spend, there is then the risk is we will then spend more on carbon emissions by buying more goods. But the way the UK and indeed the world as a whole is tackling climate change is by putting caps on the amount of carbon emissions, and the UK has a path through to 2050 when the plan is to meet the global target of a 20% cut in emissions from the base year. I can't remember the base year, but it was a good few years ago. So that's the way that the climate change has been tackled, by putting this cap on carbon emissions. It's then up to the market to decide which way those carbon emissions are generated. Now, gas will still have a role to play over the next few years. Gas per unit of energy generates far less carbon emissions than coal, for example. And as a country, we have a large number of gas fires. Gas is the most common fuel used in this country for heating our homes. Now, that will have to be phased out eventually and replaced with a carbon-free method of heating our homes. But we're not going to do away with all our gas fires tomorrow or within the next few years, although probably by 2050. So we are going to use gas, and if we are going to use gas, we may as well use the gas that's cheapest for the consumers, because that obviously helps people in a low income. So as I said earlier, the price of gas in the United States is about a third of what it is here. So that will be a benefit to the consumer. But because of the cap that the UK is placing on carbon emissions, and not just the UK, the EU and the world as a whole, then it will not actually result in any more carbon being burnt, but it does mean that it will be cheaper for the consumer.
I think part of the problem would be in as we discussed earlier on, the lowering of the state's ability to challenge multinational companies. And I, for one, certainly don't trust fracking companies and gas companies and oil companies to be the great protectors of the environment, that they have to work under strict international and national law. And as we said with the ISDS, where are the governments going to be to have, are they going to have that ability to challenge and to stop? So that would be my concern. I don't trust the multinationals to look after the environment while chasing profit at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question for which quite a few of us, I suspect, are floundering around for answers, because there's so much of it that we're not exposed to in terms of the detail of the agreement. What I would say, though, is to come back to this principle of standards. Standards can't be dropped. Our environmental carbon emission standards need to be maintained. Nothing that we can do, or no provision within Ttip, really will stand any chance of surviving if it threatens those particular standards. And where there might, potentially, and I'm sure I read this in part of my research, be some opportunity, is that there are some particular energy sources, which we're talking about there, which are higher or lower carbon emitting than others. If any of them, for example, are currently subject to tariff arrangements that make them unattractive, but by eliminating that tariff, they would then become attractive as part of a trade agreement. What you could then find is that the energy that we generate, whether it's for any kind of fuel, could actually be lower carbon. So there might be some opportunity for us to switch to lower carbon, but it would depend on individual pieces of trade fulfilling that requirement. But the principle that I said that we're going to abide by as a group of Labour politicians, Labour MEPs and so on, is that anything that is within Ttip needs to sustain and support the achievement of the carbon reduction targets. Thanks.
Thank you, panel. Another question? Yes, sir.
I'm 83 years old, so I've been around a bit. And as far as I can see from old and good, the only people that really will benefit from this agreement are the multinationals, the big, huge multinationals. They're going to make a payday. I cannot see where you get the opinion that the small people are going to benefit. How is this agreement going to benefit the small traders in the town?
For those that maybe didn't hear the gentleman in front, he told us he's 83, he's a very sprightly 83, and he said that he envisaged that the trade agreement would be of great benefit to the multinational corporations, and he's posing to the panel the question of how it would affect small traders in the town here.
Well, the small traders that it will help will be those businesses who want to export goods to the United States. The moment that they want to do that, they would have to hire a team of lawyers and various other specialists in order to see their way through the massive US regulations and US tariffs. And the big multinationals have no problem with hiring the teams of lawyers and other specialists, but the small companies just can't. So I think that this will benefit the small companies by greatly reducing the costs that they'll incur by having, if they want to break into the American market.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the question you want to ask is, who is driving this? And this isn't being driven by small, medium-sized enterprises. This has been driven by multinational corporations. It absolutely is. And again, it's going back to the idea of, had a line not been shown on this, then we would be heading down the road to goodness knows where. And thankfully, I think across Europe, from Greece to Spain, people are finally turning on their governments and are saying to the government, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of big business, or are you on the side of the people who actually elected you? And I think across Europe, there's a change. People are wanting a new democracy, a new type of politics that puts people first and doesn't put the interests of big business first. And the idea that national governments are somehow run as PLCs for PLCs is beginning to crumble, and I applaud it, and it can't crumble quickly enough, because we do need a new type of politics. We do need a new democracy across Europe, one which puts the interests of people, not the interests of big multinational corporations first.
Keep doing that, yeah. Yeah, I share some of that scepticism, as I think has probably been apparent throughout the night, which is that, where there are people who will promote it in whose interest it is. At the same time, I think there are some specific opportunities that we should be seizing. And one of them is to use this to get much better, more transparent regulation of financial services. Because as I said in my opening speech, that we had some proper regulation of the trade in subprime mortgages. And that's something that the Labour group in the European Parliament has been quite clear about, which is that financial services need to fall under the auspices of this agreement. It's all very well having iron brew, haggis, tablet, and all the rest of it. But if our whole economy ground to a halt because there was insufficient transnational regulation of the trade in financial products, then that's a sorry state of affairs. So for me, one of the hopes I have is that we would have much more transparent, in conjunction with all the other moves that are going on, because if we regulate between the US and Europe but not Singapore and Hong Kong, then we've obviously got a problem. These things need to be more than just the Europe and the US, albeit that was an axis where a lot of the financial crisis happened. So for me, that's a particular hope that could help ordinary people. It could help companies here that have, and individuals, all of whom have suffered since the financial crash. So that's one thing. But you're absolutely right. The estimates for jobs, from all the evidence I've seen, have been grossly overestimated, as they often are. Talked about the other free trade agreements. They all come hyped up to the hilt with all the great promises. They often deliver not a lot. And here's one final thought, actually. If we think that this is going to be our salvation, we're in for a rude awakening, because it's not. We need to be better at what we're doing. There are lots of other avenues we need to look at to be a successful, effective, exporting country, rather than just a particular trade agreement. There are other things that our energies would be probably much better centred on. Thanks.
Well, I mean, you say, where is it that small businesses are benefiting from this? Well, I have spent all today speaking to small businesses on this subject, and I haven't found anyone who's against it. I myself am a small business. I service other small businesses who all trade internationally nowadays. Now, of course, big multinationals will benefit, but also small businesses will as well. The island I come from has a large chunk of the population employed in the distilling industry. You may have heard that we have quite a few whiskies on island. As it stands, that revenue is growing. The number of people in work in the distilleries is growing. Our overseas exports are growing. It's a fantastic thing. It's something that should be encouraged. We really must not have this fear of the unknown, the dragons be here map of the world that existed in the Reformation era. We should embrace trade. We're a maritime trading nation. Scotland is a nation of pioneers and trailblazers, and we should not fear this, we should embrace it, and we will all benefit to greater or lesser extent. It is not the salvation, it is not the only thing, but it's part of the solution, not part of the problem. It is only one part of the solution, but it is a part nevertheless.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, time is getting on. It's not quite as far on as Mary thought it was, but you looked at my watch, if you saw us laughing there. My watch is always in our head. Well, it isn't this time of year anyway. So, yeah. And the clock in the car is 3 minutes, I think. So, one final question. If there's someone who maybe hasn't asked a question before... Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We've talked about trade between America and the UK. Traditionally, Scotland's biggest export has been Bute. If you are supporting Ttip, then surely by merit of that fact you will be encouraging immigration and emigration as a result of that. Is that your position? Party's position?
Okay, and this will be the final one.
Start with yourself, then.
If I understand you correctly, it's about the free movement of people. I'm very, very relaxed about the free movement of people. I think, if anything, Scotland needs migrants. Scotland needs skilled migrants, particularly to come to the country. And it's part of it's a part of the EU, which I think is fantastic. I think the influx of people from Poland, from other parts of the European Union has been a fantastic boon to Scotland and the Scottish economy. So I have no problem at all with more people coming to Scotland, choosing to make Scotland a home and contributing to the well-being of the nation as a whole.
Yep, I agree with what Brendan said, that the migration of people to Scotland has typically helped us a lot. I heard something quite interesting the other day, that the biggest fishing fleets out of the Western Isles are owned by a couple of Polish fellas. People here maybe know that. But I thought that was a really interesting fact, who started working on the boats about 10, 12 years ago, and now own and run the fleets themselves. So big transition, and are running fleets that maybe might not have still been there had they not come, married local, and now a successful part of the economy. An interesting wee case study. So yes, I'm not sure, if I'm honest, that there's an immediate or direct impact to migration movements because of Ttip, because of its existence, or if it doesn't happen. Nothing I've read tells me that there's a relationship between the two, other than that when you have, growing economies, however they grow, whether it's trade or through other means that they help them to grow, that then attracts people to the jobs and the prospects that are there. But yeah, if it's an issue about, whether or not we support migration of people in and out of the country, we've been doing it for as long as, we've been doing it forever. The Scots, Irish tribe, all the rest of it, it's happened forever, so I'm in favour.
I mean, no one in the United Kingdom can claim any type of purity, particularly we on the islands, who of course were a fun target for Viking longboat raiders. But when it comes down to it, I believe, of course, all immigration is good. But we need to have controlled immigration. I don't believe in uncontrolled immigration, but I do believe in immigration, and migration too. Peoples will always move and fluctuate with industry and jobs, that's true. Should we have an open door, blanket policy across Europe? No, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Do I feel that there'll be an exodus of people from Scotland to America as a result of Ttip, or an exodus from Scotland from anywhere else? No, I don't think so, frankly, no. I personally feel that we will benefit from this. Our economy will grow. And if you like, the UK is a victim of its own success. Because the economy is doing so well and wages are rising and all these things, we're seeing a massive influx of people wanting to stay here. And that's understandable. But we have to have controlled immigration, not uncontrolled immigration.
I mean, I think the question was about whether Ttip would lead to increased immigration or migration or not. I don't think
the question was what is your position
on.
Well, I asked the question, so the question was what is your position on the movement of people both in and out.
Well, I believe. Right, sorry, I misunderstood the question. I'm glad that you asked it again. I mean, I believe in the freedom of movement throughout the EU. I think that's very important. So far as migration from outside the EU is concerned, we do have tight rules about people can only come in here if they have a legitimate reason for coming, such as a spouse or a family member, or if they have if they've got a job that's well paid and that the company that wants to bring them in can't find somebody within the EU that's capable of doing that job. So, fairly in favour of the rules largely as they stand at the moment. That's free movement throughout the EU, and with the immigration rules, people coming in here if they have good cause within the current immigration rules for doing so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. That's time up, 9 o'clock rather than 10, as my watch says. I have a few thank yous to make. I would like to thank the staff at the hall here for their assistance. They've been very helpful. I'd like to thank the European Citizens Initiative, and in particular Marie there, for organising this. I'd like to thank yourselves for coming along in such numbers on a Friday night. I'd like to thank our candidates, and having been one myself, I know what a grueling campaign it is. So can I wish them all a successful campaign, if that's a possible thing to do, and can I wish you all a safe journey home. More than that.